I'm author Sarah A. Chrisman.
I'm Gabriel Chrisman.
Bestette over there decided she wanted to be in a cardboard box for this video, so we figured who are we to argue with a cat. Never turns out well if you try, so we just brought the whole box in. Today we are going to be talking about Charles Addams and his influence on how Americans see haunted houses and why so many haunted houses, as we see them as a culture, are Victorian in nature. Charles Addams wrote a series of cartoons for The New Yorker, and a lot of those followed this rather tongue-in-cheek, ghoulish family, which came to be known as the Addams Family. This later spun off the popular TV show, and there have been a few movies based around the Addams Family. So a lot of people are familiar with one of those elements of his work. Either you've read his cartoons, which I highly recommend you do because they're hilarious, or you've seen the TV show or the movies. And if you've seen the TV show or the movies, read the cartoons, they're great.
They've also just filtered into popular consciousness.
Right.
Everyone is pretty much aware of the Addams Family, or if they can't bring the name to mind, they certainly know what you're talking about once you start describing it.
Right, and he was working in the 20th century, but he had a big influence on how America as a culture sees the 19th century. Because his Addams Family, they live in a house that is architecturally Victorian in nature. It's one of the popular styles of the Victorian era.
Second Empire.
Yeah. They have oil lamps and gas lamps. They have everything inside the house is very, very Victorian. Later on they have a telephone that looks very Edwardian, and they have some cars that are Edwardian. They have a home theater system that it's a projector camera that's barely post-Victorian, but only just.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they have things like Uncle Fenster taking up falconry, and his falcons are catching the homing pigeons owned by the family on the next house over. So that's pre-Victorian.
Right.
So he mixes it up a bit. But
a lot of what he was drawing on was, he started doing these cartoons in the 1930s.
Right.
And what we're seeing in a lot of his work is the perspective of the Americans, growing up in the post-Victorian era, about seeing the evidence of basically this past grandeur of the Victorian houses, the Victorian buildings and technology in those communities, which was now falling into disrepair.
Right. So you're seeing the buildings as people in big cities saw them, which was definitely the case for the readers of his work. Remember, he drew for The New Yorker. And so in the big cities, you would see some of these old Victorian buildings that were no longer valued because everyone wanted the brand new skyscrapers. People no longer valued these Victorian structures that really had been built for the ages, but nobody wanted them anymore, which was really sad. And also, in the countryside, remember by the 1930s, you had the Dust Bowl going on. You had vast migrations of people from the heartland, from the countryside, to the cities, and they were just leaving these beautiful Victorian homes to rot. And they were just falling apart and being destroyed by the weather.
No one could afford to keep them up. A lot of those houses, especially the larger ones, were intended to operate with many servants, and no one could afford to hire the servants, and then even the servants were moving out, even the people who would potentially have worked in those positions. And so these were white elephants that no one wanted to or could maintain, and that the people of this generation no longer valued.
Right. In Milwaukee, we were recently up to Milwaukee for a program that we did up there, and I had read an article in one of our 19th century magazines about what they were calling the most fabulous mansion in the West. And this was in Milwaukee. It was a huge, huge mansion. We looked up the address where it had been, and it's now a convenience store. Not the building itself, which was torn down, but the structure that's there is a cheap convenience store, which was really heart-wrenching.
Yes. And so a lot of people, subliminally or not, had an understanding that this was the passing of an age.
That this was a whole era that was dying.
And so especially what he's bringing in here is a little bit of that combination of nostalgia with sort of vague remembrance of a time when everything was different.
And he's also bringing in the discomfort people felt with the fact there was a strong guilt, because they knew that these houses and buildings had been created for the ages as a gift for them, and they were neglecting them, they were abandoning them, they were letting them fall to pieces. And that's gotta feel guilty after a while, but Charles Addams made them come face to face with that feeling of guilt at what they were doing to these old houses.
And at the same time, he made it humorous.
And he made it humorous. And his Addams family, they're sort of displaced in time in a way. And so he sort of imagined these fictitious characters as these old Victorians coming back, and they're not leaning over people saying, "What have you done with these gifts we gave you?" No, they're just sort of living their own life in their quirky way.
Correct, yes.
Their very quirky way.
Mm-hmm.
And just the rest of the world can do its thing. They're going to do their thing, the rest of the world can do its thing, and, the more the merrier.
Part of the whole sort of morbid Gothic thing is also a remembrance of the Victorian culture's different understanding of and relationship to death, and how the modern people in the 1930s, 40s, 50s were uncomfortable with that.
Right. And it begs the question, what is more natural? What is more healthy? Is it more natural to consider death a private thing, but a part of life that we can't get away from? Or is it more natural to be living our modern lives in eternal fear of death and never speaking of it and always shutting it away? So it's an interesting question. I think it's one outside the scope of this video.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's one that definitely his comics bring up and make you think about.
Definitely. And for Halloween, you really can't beat Charles Addams. He is perfect for the Halloween holiday.
And if you are interested in and enjoy any of Charles Addams' work, you should look up Edward Gorey, who carried on the tradition in the 60s and 70s and through into the 80s, and his stuff is equally wonderful.
Gorey was mostly working with Edwardian imagery, but it's really, really quite funny. Back in college, one of my dear friends did parodies of his comics. He had a series called The Neglected Murderesses, and she took all his comics from that series and she recreated them as photographs. They were hilarious. One of them, the girl who was modeling for her had her boyfriend participate, and they'd labeled a bottle poison, and the only glass bottle they had was a bottle of vanilla extract, and the boyfriend actually drank the vanilla extract, and they said, "Oh, that didn't taste very good," and they both looked at him and said, "You just drank from a bottle labeled poison. How did you expect it to taste?" So, anyhow, definitely look into Charles Addams' work. If you haven't experienced it before, it'll make you laugh. And if you have, it'll make you laugh again. Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a nice thumbs up. And remember to tell your friends about my books. Happy reading!